Recording.
Okay.
Okay, over to you, Gerard.
Thanks, John. Well, this is a truly international webinar for the Society of History of Astronomy. Welcome to you all. May I begin by wishing you good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. This is the second of our short presentations webinars for members. The first one was last year to celebrate the Society's 20th anniversary. All the presentations are going to be recorded, so they will be available via our website after today. I would ask you to turn off, if you haven't already, your audio and video during the presentations to maximize the bandwidth so there's no interruptions to the presentations. We will, as always, have a Q&A after each presentation if time allows, and but if you wish, you can use the chat facility which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and if I don't get to your question or if you don't wish to read it out yourself at the end, we will try and make sure that our speakers will see your question and be able to answer them at a later date, probably via email, if that's convenient. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, which is Ian Ridpath, well known to everybody, and of course our wonderful editor for our the Society's own journal, the Antiquarian Astronomer. Ian is an internationally renowned writer and lecturer on astronomy and space. He is editor for the authoritative Oxford Dictionary of Astronomy and author of a wide used series of stargazing guides for beginners, including the Monthly Sky Guide. Ian is a winner of the Astronomical Society of the Pacific's Awards for outstanding contributions to the public understanding and participation of astronomy, appreciation of astronomy, sorry. Previous recipients of that award have been Carl Sagan and the late Sir Patrick Moore. He is currently the editor, as I say, of our publication, The Antiquarian Astronomer, the journal of the Society for the History of Astronomy. And to talk about the history of astronomy via Google Doodles, can I welcome, please, Ian Ridpath.
Okay, well, thank you, Gerard. Good evening. I hope you can all hear me. And this came about, this is just a bit of fun, which was inspired by Gerard's call last year for some short presentations. And it's about Google Doodles with a connection to the history of astronomy. Now, let me see if I can go into screen sharing here, like that. Okay. And yeah, I'm sharing my sound as well, which is going to be important at the end. So if you don't know what a Google Doodle is, it's a little graphic, or let's go back. It's a little graphic, or sometimes an animation that's at the top of the Google search page. And if you click on it, you get a bigger picture, sometimes even an animation. And they started back in 1998, and you now get new ones every week. In fact, sometimes every day. I don't know if you've looked today, but today's one is for International Women's Day. So have a look at that if you haven't actually looked for it. Over the years, there have been quite a number that have commemorated events or anniversaries with a connection to the history of astronomy. So I thought I'd show you some of my favorites, and we're starting here with Einstein, and this was in fact the first astronomically related doodle ever. It was released in 2003, and it commemorated Albert Einstein's birthday. It happened to be his 124th birthday, so not particularly a round figure. But you can see the clever thing, they've taken the Google logo and they've turned one of the O's into his face. So he's got his mad hair and eyebrows and moustache. And on the right there, the final letter E has become part of his famous equation E equals mc squared. Although strictly, of course, the E in the equation should really be a capital, but you know, we'll let them off with this one. Now, early doodles like the Einstein one were simply static drawings, but many of them are now animated. And the first ever moving doodle, and it didn't move very much, but the first ever moving doodle honored Isaac Newton, and it recreated the famous story of the falling apple in Newton's garden. And so this time over the top of the Google logo, we've got an apple branch hanging over the logo with two bright red apples replacing the first letter O in the logo. And the leftmost one falls to the ground, like that. And this was released in 2010, January 2010, on the 367th anniversary of Isaac Newton's birth. So they don't particularly go for round numbers. Well, going back into much more ancient history, the oldest astronomer to be featured so far is the 10th century Persian called Al-Sufi, also known by the Latinized name Azofi. And around the year 964 AD, he produced a revised and updated version of the star catalogue in Ptolemy's Almagest. And Al-Sufi's book was known as the Book of the Fixed Stars. And Al-Sufi adopted the same constellations as Ptolemy had listed in the Almagest some 800 years earlier, all 48 of the Ptolemaic constellations. And now the Almagest itself didn't have any constellation pictures, but Al-Sufi's book did. And in fact, it contained two images of each constellation, one as we see it from Earth and the other one in mirror image as it appears on a celestial globe. Now, at this time, this particular doodle, they've taken the two O's in the Google logo and they've made them into the two views of Cancer the crab, one as we see it in the sky, one as we see it on a globe. And these particular illustrations come from a manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. And you can see the other letters in the Google logo are also drawn in Arabic calligraphy. And this doodle was released in 2016, and it was the 1113th anniversary of Al-Sufi's birth. Now, Ptolemy himself, by the way, he hasn't had a doodle yet, probably because he'd be very difficult to illustrate. We don't have pictures of him, and as I say, his book itself didn't have any pictures. Now, many doodles are released only in certain countries, and that was certainly the case with the Al-Sufi doodle, which was restricted to North Africa and the Middle East. So us in Northern Europe wouldn't have seen it. But on the same day, Google had a completely different doodle in Europe and much of the rest of the world, and that commemorated the 340th anniversary of the determination of the speed of light by the Danish astronomer Ole Riemer. Now, in this one, the logo incorporates a diagram reminding us that Rømer made his discovery by timing eclipses of Jupiter's moon Io. And you can see the orbit of the Earth around the sun here and the orbit of Io around Jupiter. And they've taken the place of the two O's in the Google logo. So that was his diagram. And on the right here, this is the animated bit. We see Rømer himself pacing thoughtfully up and down between looking through a telescope pointed out of his window. Now, historically, this isn't strictly accurate because the telescope shown in the doodle that he's looking through there is actually a meridian instrument, and it's not the one that he used for observing Jupiter. So there's a bit of artistic license there. Now, women astronomers, this being International Women's Day, women astronomers have received their fair share of doodles, and one of them is Caroline Herschel, and she was commemorated in 2016 on her 266th birthday. And it's an animated doodle, which I'll run now. And we can see Caroline bending down to look through a small refractor perched on a table, while a meteor shower blazes through the skies above her. Now, there are a couple of big mistakes in this doodle that I'm sure you've already spotted, because in reality, she used a small reflector made for her by her brother William, not a refractor. And of course, they've confused meteors with comets, which was what she was famous for discovering. And also, I don't think she observed in such a windswept location. But apart from that, it's absolutely spot on, apart from that. And incidentally, Caroline is the only one of the Herschel family who has been doodled so far, and I expect that William and John will get their own doodles one day. Now, I don't know if our president, Alan Chapman, ever saw this one from 2020, but he'd have been delighted by it, for it commemorates Mary Somerville, and he's a great admirer of Mary Somerville. And Alan's, of course, written a book about her. And Mary Somerville and Caroline Herschel were elected the first female honorary members of the RAS. And the doodle commemorates the fact that she was the first female author to be published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And in the Google logo, you can see that they've drawn in little references to the various branches of science that she contributed to. And there she's busily writing the stack of books. There's no animation on this one, it's just a static picture. Now, December the 13th is the maximum of the Geminid meteors, but it's also the birthday of the great Norwegian scientist Christian Birkeland. Now, he was the first to explain the true cause of the Northern Lights, and his doodle was released in 2013, although this is another one that was very restricted. It was released only in Norway, but I quite like it because it shows him in front of the Google logo, which in this case has been sort of turned into an advertising sign. It's glowing green, like drawn like a twisting advertising sign. And that's quite scientifically accurate because, of course, the physics of the aurora is similar to what happens in a neon tube. Now, we had a paper in the Antiquarian Astronomer about this chap a couple of years ago. It's Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian cosmologist who also happened to be a priest, and he devised what we now call the Big Bang Theory. And it's an animated doodle, which I'll run for you. And you can shows the constantly expanding universe that he envisioned, with dots and bits representing galaxies expanding outwards, as he said they would. And it's actually quite fascinating. The more you look at it, the more detail you see of little galaxies coming into view and fading out. And the whole Google logo itself is sort of animated as though it's galaxies expanding. So I think this is actually quite a clever graphic. And this one appeared in 2018, and that was on the 124th anniversary of his birth. Now, this is another clever one. It's commemorating Subramanian Chandrasekhar, and it attempts to explain the Chandrasekhar limit in a little cartoon with a pair of scales and the sun and a white dwarf. Now, in the pan on the right, there's a weight with 1.44 solar masses written on it, which is, of course, the Chandrasekhar limit. And the sun is bouncing up and down on the left of the scales, but it's not as heavy as the Chandrasekhar limit. Then the sun hops out and a white dwarf falls in instead. And the white dwarf is over the Chandrasekhar limit, and it ends up exploding as a supernova. So that's actually some quite complex physics illustrated in a neat little cartoon. And that was released in 2017, and it commemorated Chandrasekhar's 107th birthday. And the most recent doodle with a history of astronomy theme commemorated Stephen Hawking, and it was released last year on the 80th anniversary of his birth. Now, Stephen himself, unfortunately, didn't make it to 80. He died when he was 76, but even that seemed impossible when he was diagnosed with motor neurone disease when he was 21. So he had physically he had a very restricted life, but of course, mentally, he was very free. Now, for this one, they've actually made a 2.5-minute cartoon of his life and work, narrated using his actual voice synthesizer. And I won't play it all, but here's a clip.
My name is Stephen Hawking. My expectations were reduced to 0 at 21. Everything since then has been a bonus. Although I cannot move and I have to speak through a computer, in my mind I am free. I have spent my life traveling across the universe, inside my mind. My goal is simple. It is a complete understanding of the universe, why it is as it is, and why it exists at all.
Well, there we go. That's a nice, simple ambition, isn't it? To understand the universe and why it exists. But now, those are just some examples. There's also Galileo, Edmund Halley, Copernicus, Tycho, Kepler, Percival Lowell, and others. And in fact, all the doodles are archived online, and you can find them at the address on the screen, or just simply Google Doodle Archive. So next time you see a new doodle, take a closer look, because there might be more to it than you first think. Okay, Gerard, back to you.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. That's fascinating. Things you see basically nearly every day, but you generally ignore. I do remember when you first suggested that you speak about Google Doodles, I actually tried to suggest one to them, because I know you said to me you can actually suggest a possible doodle, and I think for obvious reasons, and I am biased, one related to William Lassell and the discovery of Triton in 1846, but I'm not too sure whether it was ever created.
No, it hasn't happened. But one day I'm sure they've got a whole stack of ideas which
Yes.
they'll get round to in the next 100 years or something.
Okay, I was wondering, I've got time for one or two questions if anyone wants to ask Ian anything. If you want to raise your hand, we'll try and get to you. No, I think everyone's happy, Ian.
Good. No, they're all busily Googling doodles now.
Yes, yeah. Anyway, Ian, thank you very much indeed. It's
Okay, pleasure.
Fascinating. And yeah, I'll keep an eye out for, or let us know any new ones that you might see. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our second speaker for tonight. May I introduce Bernie Taylor, is a naturalist and archaeoastronomer whose research explores the origins of mankind's creativity and awareness of the natural world through Upper Paleolithic cave art. His two books in this area are Biological Time, published in 2004, and Beyond Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero, published in 2017. Bernie's presentation is based on his 2021 paper, published in the journal Physica. Bernie is going to talk about Homo Paleolithica. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, but Bernie, over to you.
Thank you, Gerard. That was brilliant. And before I begin, I'd like to thank, or say it's an honor to follow Ian. I'm a huge fan of his work. Star Tales is my go-to book on Greek astronomy. And I'd also like to shout out that Nick Canis is in the audience, and Nick is the foremost NASA psychologist who explains to us why we're never going to go very far in space over generations. But he has done brilliant work and so forth. So I'm going to now pull up I'm going to share screen and entire screen, share, Bernie,
Yes.
current slide.
We're okay.
And we're all good.
Okay.
So Homo Pareidoia and Bernie Taylor. Okay. Today we would travel further back in time than the ancient Greeks and the brilliant work of Ian to ask why we have looked deep into the night sky with apparent game, how we have rationalized our following of the great mythological constellational heroes as they pass through the seasons. Could these connections have existed deep in prehistory, or somehow part of our being human? In this presentation, Homo Pareidoia, we look into the Paleolithic mind that I believe to be our own, so as to answer these questions, perhaps find roots with the night sky that connect us all. Homo pareidoia, that may appear to be a bold title and hypothesis. I believe Pablo Picasso would have been curious. The Spanish artist had a similar notion when he said, it occurred to man to create his own images. It's because he discovered them in the world around him, almost formed, already within his grasp. He saw them in a bone, in the irregular surfaces of cavern walls, in a piece of wood. One form might suggest a woman, another a bison. Picasso recognized that these natural irregularities in the rock with the appearance of horse heads were dressed up with black to give a more detailed impression of the same. The Spanish artist borrowed these heads for his now famous 1907 painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Pareidoia is that apparently unique ability in the human mind to find faces of people and other animal beings in geological formations, the clouds, and constellations among the stars. But before we search out pareidoia in the stellar realm, let's look for the possible origins of night sky pareidoia closer to terra firma. I promise you a stellar ending, as well as some interesting images along the way. We travel now to the Basque Country in northern Spain, where we can view the mountain Chindoki, whose peak is about 1,300 meters. My pronunciation of Basque names are not likely correct, but they are spelled correctly in this presentation. Chindoki is sacred among the Basque people who have inhabited this region since at least the Neolithic. The origins of the Basque are an enigma, as many believe their language is not connected to any other European language groups. Some suggest that the Basques were in the region during the Upper Paleolithic. The Basques believe that their mother deity Mary seasonally dwells in Marizolo, a cave on Chindoki. Marizolo literally means Mary's cave. One can see the climbing route to Marizolo with the cave marked by the blue arrow. This cave is on the other side of Chindoki that we viewed in the previous slide. Mary dwells in caves on two other sacred Basque mountains as well. While mountains in general are important to the Basque and are the foundation of their creation mythology, Chindoki is one of the most important mountains in their mythology. This image of Chindoki, as marked with the red arrow, was taken from the position indicated by the yellow arrow. The photographer had a westerly view of Chindoki. We will return to this face of Chindoki shortly. It's important. We travel now to the El Pindal cave in nearby Asturias, Spain. The current walking time between the El Pindal cave and Chindoki is about 55 hours, covering 262 kilometers. Google Maps uses 5 kilometers per hour to calculate walk times. In the El Pindal cave, there is the principal panel, which has red markings, engraved lines, and interesting natural irregularities. This and the remaining cave art images were taken by the esteemed Japanese photographer Taki Fukawa, who has permitted me to use his work. These digital images are both artistic and technological achievements. They were objectively photographed with flood lighting. What an individual sees when squinting or playing with shadows isn't objective or reproducible. We all need to have the same visual information. We can break the principal panel down into some of its elements and find recognizable natural features from Chindoki. Those features on both have the appearance of a straight-tusked elephant with lower tusks and trunk. The mountain is living in an animistic sense of the word. On the El Pindal panel, there is a rough feature in gold as marked by the blue arrow that appears to be a natural irregularity and possibly what drew the Ice Age artist to the face of this panel. Earlier, I noted that the current walking time between the El Pindal cave and Chindoki is about 55 hours. There's a lot of cave wall space much closer to Chindoki than a 55-hour walk. This cave panel irregularity is at the vein of what Picasso observed when coming to the conclusion that man discovered images in the world around him, almost formed, already within his grasp. This is something beyond what Picasso described, though. Pareidoia outside of the cave is being projected onto the wall in the cave, where there's a similar natural irregularity in the rock. When we widen our view of the panel, the head of an unusual character emerges from behind the elephant. A green arrow marks the right side of the being's head. The character comes from over and behind the mountain and elephant. The flow of this representation that may be snaking through the red dashes area painted by the Ice Age artists are indicated by the blue arrows. This character has the impression of the wind and may extend to the peak of the depicted mountain. The wind-like character is not part of the mountain. I believe that this character is a representation of the Basque Ode, who is a spirit of thunder and the personification of storm clouds. Ode is an agent of Mary. This weather spirit appears to be emerging from the side of Mary's cave. The straight-tusked elephant may be another Basque mythological character. In Basque tradition, Mary transforms into other characters, such as the shapeshifter red bull, bovine, they call Axte to do her bidding. Axte is believed to be a cave-dwelling spirit. After the Ice Age, when the elephants and woolly mammoths left Europe, the bats may have substituted the horned bovine for the tusked elephant. They may both be bulls, just not bulls of the same species. In this case, we have a red-spotted elephant reinforcing the Basque connection. The gold-colored natural regularity extends from above the Chindoki elephant, as indicated by the blue arrow, and there is the impression of a second and larger elephant above it. Such an elephant would be partly above the mountain. The principal panel is wild to say the least. There are more lines and curved surfaces to explore and possible connections to be made. Now let's turn our attention to another upper parallel cave. We traveled from Chindoki to the Las Monedas cave in Cantabria, Spain. Las Monedas is in El Castillo mountain. There's a cave of the same name, among others. The current walking time between Chindoki and the Las Monedas cave is about 44 hours. In the Las Monedas cave, there is the panel of mass that appears to be as enigmatic as the El Pindal principal panel. On the panel of mass, we find the Peredur elephant character visualized on Chindoki, and both are the same as depicted at the El Pindal cave. The peak of the smaller elephant's head is marked by the red arrows, and the blue arrow indicates the head of the larger elephant in shadow. The smaller elephant had previously been identified as a mammoth. We also find the wind character Ode again, who comes from behind the mountain. There's also a therianthrope, the mix of human and another animal being in the center. He has foxish ears and peers through a magical mask. One might consider his ears to be elven in today's mythological vernacular. A second mask facing down is to the viewer's far right. This panel was previously titled the panel of mask, based on the mask in the center and the impression of mass around the surrounding dark lines. The Ode and foxish eared characters appear to be new finds. Had these spiritual characters been refound in modern times, but were too controversial to discuss, or was the data to more fully analyze these images not previously available? I sometimes scratch my head with these questions. Those dark lines over Ode's outstretched right arm are flowers such as winged broom marked by the red arrows, a large maple leaf as indicated by the blue arrows, and a scattering of Spanish junipers that appear to be blowing in the wind. One can sense a gust of air animating the flora. This panel has the appearance of a late summer scene. This is important, perhaps in the evening or just before sunrise when the colors of the flora cannot be seen. We have now established collaborative links between the vast characters depicted on the walls of two upper pillars of the caves and a still sacred mountain in the region. Continuing our investigation of the Homo Peredur hypothesis, we return to Pico Panamera, that is in Asturias, Spain. Pico Panamera is a fairly low mountain at about 700 meters, but has a lot of character. Regional mountaineers refer to this peak as a little Matterhorn, based on similar geometry with the Matterhorn of the Alps. There's a rounded hill to the viewer's left known as Pendendo. The photo of Pico Panamera in the previous image, as marked here with the red arrow, was taken into alleys, indicated by the yellow arrow. The photographer had an easterly view of Pico Panamera, and this is important. We may learn more about how Ice Age peoples viewed Pico Panamera at the Las Chimeneas cave in Monte El Castillo. That's about a 14-hour walk. Pico Panamera has some resemblance to a panel in the hall of the paintings at Las Chimeneas cave. I've taken the liberty to name the scene the Panel of the Bears. In the absence of any known name, can you see the bears? Your eyes may have been initially drawn to the strong black lines on the panel, but if we pull our gaze away from them, an unhappy mother bear with at least one cub on her head emerges in relief. The mother bear's forelegs are stationary. She appears to be searching for something. Below the she bear is an alpine coe, a bird common in the region, which looks up to her. This may be a scene in a myth. The bears and dark lines appear to resemble Pico Panamera and the lower Pendendo in the foreground. The she bear has a touch of white on her muzzle, which may represent snow and the white of the mountain. We can more clearly see the bear and the stronger resemblance with Pico Panamera in this close-up shot, even features for the bear cub blob on her head. The she bear seems to be coming out of the mountain as if she is part of the geological formation and the sky at the same time. We will return to this concept later. We may be able to find more answers to this arrangement of bears and mountains through these two panels in the Las Monedas cave and Cueva de la Pera. Both are a long 2 days walk from Pico Panamera. I've also named each of these the panel of bears in the absence of other known names. Can you count the bears? I'm sorry. Stop, skate. Sorry, I had to hang on. I gotta skip that. That's my fault. Go to slide. I had this previously recorded. The Los Monedos cave includes the lower Pendendo in the foreground as a pack of hyenas and a greater width of features from Pica Panamera. The hyenas appear to be stealing a bear cub. I more closely examined this and the following panel in other presentations that can be found on my webpage. The other example is in Cueva de Vento de Pera, where we find the mother bear who has scooped up bones in the frozen head of a different animal, the European wolverine, reinforcing the seasonality to be winter. Why does it depict bears other than possible astronomy? A standing bear has many human-like physical characteristics. We once competed for the same food sources, and this animal being greatly cares for its young, such that we today still archetypally use the term mother bear about protective mother bears. That's a call out to the youngins out there. The symbolic, from a spiritual standpoint, the bear also has seasons in its life, whereby the animal being hibernates in the winter cave, thus symbolically entering the underworld, and then emerges in the winter and the spring to be reborn. I have a trip planned in the early autumn of this year to climb these and other mountains. I'm curious to see the mountain peak viewpoints of the artists. Remember the bear that went over the mountain to see what he could see? Maybe I will only see the other side of the mountain, a climb will tell. When studying photographs of mountains in northern Spain, I observed many mountains that have elephant-like features, such as projected onto the walls of El Pindal and Los Monedos. Both the El Pindal and Los Monedos elephants also appear to have large elephants above them, which we don't see in Chindoki. I believe that the answer is not just pareidolia found in the mountains, but also in their relative positions to the night sky during the depicted seasons. Note that the cave artists would have been looking easterly at Pica Panamera during the late winter. We now look to the night sky. In this image generated in Starry Night Pro 8, a software package utilized by professional astronomers and planetariums, we can dial back the clock and look easterly at Pica Panamera to see what the cave artists would have viewed in that time and place. See how the she-bear, Ursa Major, as marked by the red arrow, would have been viewed meeting the dawn. We see the she-bear here pictured as the ancient Greeks found her form. Maybe the Ice Age artists illustrate her lines differently. Remember the same depicted direction that the bears face on the 3 cave panels. What if the mother bear was drawn in reverse by the Ice Age artist during the late winter? Indigenous peoples around the world animate the stars of Ursa Major in different forms as the she-bear travels through the seasons. The heads of both the Las Chimeneas and Cueva de Vento de Pera mother bears would fit neatly between the currently depicted Ursa Major tail and her right leg. The forward arm of the Las Monedas mother bear could have been represented by the long tail of Ursa Major. We all know that bears don't have tails, which has been a curiosity among ancient and modern astronomers for the stars of Ursa Major. The constellations also appear to move from left to right across the night sky. The reason why the mother bears in Las Chimeneas, Los Monedos, and Vento de Pera caves appear to be frozen in time and in Pica Panamera, maybe because they couldn't travel in the direction of the viewer's left in the night sky. Using Starry Night Pro 8 again, although this time with a westerly view, we look back at how the cave artists would have seen Chindoki in their time and place. See the prominent stars in the horns of Taurus, as the ancient Greeks depicted the constellation. The horns of Taurus closely resemble the hind legs and trunk pareidolia of the elephant in Chindoki, as the mountain would have been viewed merging with the dawn. Or are the 2 elephants of both panels depicted in the lines of Taurus? I am not sure of the answer. The Bas Oxte, that is their shapeshifter red bovine deity, may have been the Upper Pelthic word for Ursa Major. Chindoki may have been an Ice Age word as well. The mountains and constellations are living. One can imagine how magical these meetings of the realms would have been to Ice Age peoples, so magical that the cave artists then projected the view onto the underworld of the cave walls to complete the transcendental experience and perhaps spiritually continue the yearly cycle of life. Both Ursa Major and Taurus were known among Orignacian peoples about 34,000 years ago in northern Spain, as shown here from last year's anniversary webinar and other conferences that can be found on my webpage. Note that many recognizable constellations can be seen on this earlier panel versus 1 on each of the previous panels shown today. This suggests that the 34,000-year-old panel is closer to the source. Remember the fox's ears Theriamtro in the Las Monedas cave, who peers through the magical mask at the wonders of his cosmos, whom we have become by looking through his magical mask. He is, and we are, Homer Pareidolia, visualizing the impossible among mountains, cracks in the walls of caves, and in the night sky. Here in this interpretation, where the sacred and the scientific are one, where we encounter this cosmoscape through the Paleolithic mind that is still our own. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. More of my work can be found at these sites. I'm always open to cooperate in projects and virtually present my research to community and academic audiences.
Bernie, thanks very much indeed. That was fascinating. I've got time for one or two questions if there's anybody out there who wishes to ask a question. Nick, over to you.
Yeah, I have a question, Bernie. Yeah, this is
Sure.
very interesting work, and I've been kind of following it with you for some time. In the third edition of my Star Maps book, I wanted to include some Paleolithic art, which I did. I don't know if I can do a screen share or not, but it's the one that shows the Auroch and it ties it into the area around the Pleiades and the Hyades. You probably are familiar with it. I could
Yes,
show that.
Of course, you sent it to me.
Yes, you can screen share it. Everybody can screen share, but don't do
all
it all
right.
at once.
Let me see if I can find that. Let's see if I can do this here. Okay, this is sent to me by a NASA guy who took the Auroch on the left and then paralleled it with the chart of the sky on the right, and he speculated that the 4 dots on the left were equivalent to Orion's belt, and the Auroch was in the middle, and then the Pleiades was in the upper right. This is about 17,000 years ago. So something like this is fairly obvious, but also speculative because we don't know for sure what it was. Curiously, the Auroch is not a bull, even though it's kind of a hooved animal. But my question is, something like this is fairly obvious, but speculative. Some of the things that you've been showing us too are perhaps less obvious. How do you kind of justify the accuracy of this? In other words, have you ever done something like shown your pictures to 15 people and done an analysis of how many of them see what you see versus maybe see other things? I mean, we know perception based on Mars and the canals of Mars, perception can be distorted in different people. How do you kind of put it all together in a way that you think you can justify the accuracy of what you're seeing in the caves versus maybe other people's views?
Question from a psychologist as well. And okay, so there's a few questions in there. First one is you have the Lascaux, the bull panel, and you have the Orion with the 4 stars in the belt, and then you have another one with five stars, another one 6 stars above it for allegedly the Pleiades. And I took a completely different approach to that.
Yeah.
My approach is lunar time, and there's also 2 Aurochs there, and so and I'll be talking about other lunar timing approaches in my presentation in another month or 2. So that covers the bulls. So your other question is, have I tested the images with other people? And if I admitted to that to you right now, I would be breaking all kinds of research rules. Okay, if I actually said what I did, the answer is yes, but I can't explain that because then there's all integrity issues. So then you're asking the question: do other people, they've seen my work, can they see the same type of things? Well, there's a range. It's actually fascinating. There's a range. People are very high on, let's say, the engineering and electrical engineering versus high on the artistic range. They have different perceptions of what they can see by themselves. The people on the artistic range, everything just jumps out at them. I mean, they see the same characters in the same order and all the details and so forth. Whereas people on the engineering end, they really struggle, especially like electrical engineers. The same people, electrical engineers, can look at the sky, they don't see a bunny, whereas on the artistic range, they see a zoo. So the answer is we're all different. And Picasso saw pareidolia in the cave wall that he saw with the heads of horses, and then transferred to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. How many millions of people have seen that image? Actually, many millions have seen both the Altamira and the Les Demoiselles image, but no one previously had documented that those two are in fact the same. And so so the answer to the question is that we all see things differently. But people see this, people then see the same lines, the same engravings and so forth. And what the strength of the gallery of disc image, which I showed at the end, which I gave a presentation last year, is that all the characters, all the constellations, El Papillo, the constellations, they're in the same order as the ancient Greeks. And what happened was that, that was 34,000 years ago. People moved and stopped migrating to different places over time. And as they moved and stopped migrating, they found new churches and new temples, and they found new mountains where they found these images. And I could actually create, it's a wide range that would take about an hour and a half to do just of these northern Iberian mountains. But yes, it's a very good question, and don't report me for any research integrity issues.
No, actually, I'm dying to see if you've done some research. Being kind of a researcher myself, I'm dying to see what you did, because I'm always worried about how much are we reading into it, and how much was there an intention by prehistoric humans to display the sky or display some of these objects, and it'd be anyone who could put some kind of scientific objective testing to that. I think it'd be very fascinating. So if you ever get around to putting it together and publishing it, I'd love to see an article, or maybe you could even present it here.
Gentlemen, I don't wish to be rude, but we must move on. So any further questions, Nick, Bernie, please
I think it's very
communicate them.
interesting. Thank you.
Okay, if that's okay, Bernie, we'll move on to Nick now on our third presentation this evening. And if I introduce Nick to you, Nick Lomb worked at Sydney Observatory for over 30 years, mainly as curator of astronomy. He is now honorary professor of the University of South Queensland and researches the history of Australian astronomy. His most recent book with Tone Stevenson was recently published and is called Eclipse Chasers, and was published by the CSICO in the beginning of this month in March. So Nick is going to talk about Francis McLean and the total eclipses of 1908, 1910, and 1911. Over to you, Nick, and welcome.
Well, good morning and good evening all. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne in Australia. It's a little bit confusing. I used to work at Sydney Observatory, then moved to Melbourne, but at the same time I have an affiliation with the University of Southern Queensland, which is a much warmer place, than I'm in Melbourne. So I hope you can all see the screen. Is that right? Is that right, Gerald?
Yes, that's great. So thank you, Nick. We can see it.
Okay, thanks. So I'm talking to you about Francis McLean and 3 solar eclipses. Francis McLean was a British aviator who flew planes like the one illustrated, and he organised expeditions to an eclipse in the Pacific near Australia in 1908, to an expedition in Tasmania in 1910, and he also took part in a expedition to an eclipse again in the Pacific in 1911. So who was Francis McLean? He was born in 1876 in London. His father was Frank McLean, who was a civil engineer, but also known for his astronomy. He did a spectroscopic survey of bright stars in both the northern and southern hemisphere. He discovered oxygen in stellar spectra, and he patented the spectroscopic eyepiece, an eyepiece with a direct vision that gave a spectrum. Francis McLean, the one we're talking about now, was also a civil engineer like his father, and like his father, he also had an interest in astronomy. As a civil engineer, he worked for a number of years in India, but he came back. He was interested in flying. He took part in a number of balloon races in 1907 to 1908. Now, of course, this was flying balloons in the days before it became fashionable to shoot down balloons with $1 million rockets. Also, a balloon race is not what you imagine. Doesn't go for speed, because all balloons basically fly just at the speed of the wind. But in fact, it was a test of pilot skill. They had a number of tasks to perform, and those who did it best, or the person who did it best, was the winner. However, his interest in balloons changed when Wilbur Wright came in 1908 to Le Mans race course in France. Wilbur and Orville Wright, of course, were the first to develop heavier-than-air aircraft in 1903, but they didn't really demonstrate their achievements for a number of years, and people in Europe started becoming skeptical. So Wilbur Wright brought his aeroplane biplane to Le Mans in France, and it seems he took up on flights a number of people with him, among them Francis McLean. So then on, he became interested in flying with aircraft. He purchased land at Eastchurch in the island of Sheppey, and there he conducted experiments in flying. He was associated with the Short brothers, who switched to aircraft manufacture, and he tested their aircraft. He wanted others to share his interests, and he lent his land to the Royal Aero Club at a nominal cost. He had a number of aircraft. In fact, he had 16 aircraft for the years before the First World War, and he offered his aircraft first to the War Office, then to the Admiralty. It was the Admiralty accepted the aircraft and began having pilots learn to fly, and it was the beginning of the Fleet Air Arm. During World War I, Francis McLean was the chief instructor at Eastchurch. 1926, he was knighted for services to aviation, and he died in London in 1955. Now let's look at the 3 eclipses. The first one was in Flint Island, which is 720 kilometers from Tahiti, but it was sort of part of Tahiti, the Pacific Islands. So that's the track of the 1908 eclipse. The next one was in Tasmania. As you can see, the eclipse, the central track misses the island, but in fact the northern limit was covered most of the island. And the third one was in 1911, 29th of April 1911, went through the island of Wavo, which is part of Tonga. Flint Island, as you can see, it's a sort of a very narrow island. It's 4 kilometers long by 0.8 kilometers wide, so less than a kilometer wide. It was one of 2 possible Pacific islands with a landfall for the eclipse of 1908, but totality was longer at Flint Island, and the sun was higher in the sky there, so that was chosen. The expedition led by McLean was not the only one there. There was also an expedition from Lick Observatory, which was led by William Wallace Campbell, And of course, Lick Observatory had a whole series of solar expeditions to total solar eclipses. The island is surrounded by a coral reef. It only one narrow passage, so landing was quite tricky. Now, who were the people on the expedition? Of course, there's Francis McLean. He couldn't get anybody interested in Britain in the expedition. So with great confidence, to me it's very impressive confidence, he boarded on his own the ship Himalaya with 15 cases of equipment and expected he could form an exhibition at the expedition. And in Sydney, yes, he managed to recruit a number of people. He recruited James Short, who was the photographer for Sydney Observatory at Sydney Observatory's field station at Red Hill Observatory, which was sort of the outer fringes of Sydney in those days. So now it's part of Sydney, suburb of Sydney, Red Hill or Pennant Hills. He also met Joseph Brooks, who was a retired surveyor. He used to be the field astronomer for the Trigonometrical Survey of New South Wales. And William Raymond, who was the first assistant at Sydney Observatory. From Sydney, with his recruits, he travelled to Auckland. And there he recruited Henry Winkleman, who was a photographer, and a vicar, Reverend Frederick Walter, who had a prior interest in astronomy, and he had a telescope in his garden. And of course, this is McLean. Now, who lived on the island? The island was leased to a company called Lever's Plantation Limited, and they employed 25 Tahitians to collect copra. Copra being the produce of coconut trees. The inside of the white meat of coconuts, when they're dried, coconut oil can be extracted. So it was quite a valuable export commodity. And there is McLean posing with some of the islanders. I really like this photo, but it's somewhat mysterious. It was presumably taken at the arrival of the expedition, but it could have been at the departure as well, with all the equipment piled up. Some of them still in cases, some unpacked. Telescope there on a stand, or a camera on the stand behind there. There are tents there, so this is presumably the tent of where they set up their tent for the expedition. This person behind is the photographer Henry Winkleman. He had a habit of setting up a photo of his photos and then running into them. But the three people at the front are not identified. But my guess is that this is the manager of the island, a guy called Mortimer. And I would imagine the company would not have sent a manager onto the island on his own, because with the fear of him going native. So my suspicion is one of these two ladies, his wife, presumably this one, and as the two women look very similar, I'm guessing they're sisters. So got there possibly the manager of the island and sister and with wife and sister, and Winkleman at the rear. Among the equipment that McLean brought to the island, or had brought out from England, was the siderostat, And that's a mirror that's used to reflect sunlight into a horizontal telescope or horizontal camera. Much easier to move a mirror towards the sun than to have a large telescope tracking the sun. So this is Joseph Brooks here, setting up the driving mechanism for the cytorostat, for the mirror. If you look carefully, you can see a tower at the back. Hopefully you can see that. It's a little bit tricky to see, but that's from Lick Observatory. They had a completely different system of looking at the sun during an eclipse. They had a vertical tower as a support for a telescope. It was a 12-meter vertical tower, and they used that Chabelle camera at 13 solar expeditions. Other instruments included the Delarue coronagraph, developed by obviously the British astronomer Delarue. Coronagraph was an instrument to take photographs of the sun. It has now, in modern times, a slightly different meaning because modern coronagraphs have occulting discs at the front, and they're designed to try and see the corona even during outside an eclipse. But in those days, it was just a device to photograph the sun. And the Delarue coronagraph had been previously used in Novaya Zemlya, which is in the Arctic Circle, India and Spain, on previous eclipses at these places. And it had a 12 centimeter aperture, 2.5 meter focal length. There's also a spectroscope with a long focal length. James Short had brought out from Sydney Observatory a photoheliograph, which is the device illustrated on here. It used to be on display at Sydney Observatory. And it's a device with a 10 centimeter aperture and a f15 focal ratio to give a reasonable size image of the sun. And Short also brought out a telephoto camera, or several telephoto cameras, and there was also a small Grubb telescope used for sketching the sun during the eclipse. Of course, it was raining. It was raining before totality. It did stop. The rain did stop just as Bailey's beads came into view. There's still some cloud for the first minute of the 4-minute totality, but they did manage to take some successful images. 4 plates were taken with the Delarue coronagraph, while James Short managed to take 5 images, including this what I really like, this image of the diamond ring. On their return, William Raymond, who was the first assistant at Sydney Observatory, wrote an article that about their life on the island. While the expedition was there, he mentioned there was a coconut crab on the island with very powerful jaws and teeth, and that crab could take off a man's arm. There were also turtles on the island, and the natives used to find them at night, turn them on their backs, and then bring them in during daylight. To me, it seems horrendously cruel, but that's how it was done in those days. Let's go on to the second eclipse, the one in Tasmania. As I said, the central line missed Tasmania, but most of the island was within the northern limit. there was an official eclipse to official Australian eclipse, and they went to the east coast of the island, to Bruny Island. Now, the weather prospects, because this was in May, which in Australia is late autumn, the weather prospects was fairly poor. So the JPEC, the Joint Permanent Eclipse Committee in London, decided not to send out an expedition, but they loaned equipment to both expeditions. McLean arrived on in Hobart on 24th of March. He was joined by Joseph Brooks, the retired surveyor who was there at the previous eclipse. A new person also came along, James Henry Worthington, a wealthy British astronomer. There's a very good write-up of him in the Journal of the BAA year or two ago. He had travelled extensively in the United States, and there he met all the important astronomers like George Ellery Hale at Mount Wilson and Percival Lowell at Flagstaff. And McLean and Brooks and Worthington went looking for a suitable place. They chose Port Davey on the west coast. And obviously they wanted to be on the west, because to give a better chance that one of the two expeditions, the official Australian one or McLean's expedition, would be successful. And who were the expeditioners? There was McLean, very impressive looking person on that photograph. There was Joseph Brooks. There was James Worthington. Henry Winkleman, the photographer. James Short. And the two new observers, Alan Edwin Young and S.G. Dowsett. So also a steward. I mean, they needed a little bit of comfort, so they had a steward to look after them and a carpenter. They arrived 10th of April 1910 on a ship called the Vanui. Unfortunately, there was constant rain. The first task was to drag the equipment up to the summit where the observing site, they'd chosen the observing site to be, and the rain made this extremely difficult, so it was very hard work. To be able to cope with the work, they had a fixed routine: 8 a.m. breakfast, lunch 1 p.m, and they ended work at 6:30 p.m. In the evening, they amused themselves with cards. They also with music. They did accordion, they did a concertina. And what is interesting is they also had a pair of bones. And the story of this pair of bones is that it was a sirloin of beef that was meant to go to Dr. Brooks of Hobart, but somehow it came to Joseph Brooks at Port Davey at the expedition site. So they ate the beef and they used the bones to have some kind of percussion for their music. So they had to drag all 32 cases up to the summit. And to complicate things, at one stage, they left one of the cases open while they went to lunch, and the straw caught alight, and then a major fire on their hands. But fortunately they managed to put out the fire and save the camp. James Short arrived A little bit later, a few weeks after the rest of the group. One they were already setting up, and setting up was very difficult because of the constant wind and the rain. So trying to protect the instrument from the wind, they built windbreaks around the instrument. These were posts stuck into the ground filled with brushwood. But to keep the instruments within the windbreaks, they had to keep them fairly low. But that meant that the instruments got splattered by mud from the boots of people walking around. So it was all fairly difficult. McLean again bought his siderostat. He also bought a coelostat, which is a similar type of mirror, but it's rather easier to drive. It only needs driving in around one axis. James Short bought a double coronagraph, which initially he meant to put on this equatorial mount, but because of the wind, McLean told him to use the siderostat, and so he had mounted his coronagraphs horizontally and used the light from the siderostat. So he had a spare mount. He put up he had a small telephoto camera. That's James Short, and this is Worthington, and Worthington mounted also another camera on the same equatorial mount. Of course, again, rain, but this time it didn't stop during the eclipse. It stopped soon afterwards. As James Short says, the rain ceased soon after it ending of the total phase. A hazy sun being seen later through thin clouds, but they couldn't see anything for the eclipse. Then they had to pack up the equipment, drag the instruments down to the embarkation point. They used sleds to bring them down, which actually made them easier to bring them down. And from there, once they were picked up by the ship, the instruments were taken to Melbourne in Australia. The instruments were then dried, repaired, and then they were put into storage, ready for the next eclipse. They were probably rather disappointed to find that even though they couldn't see anything, somebody did see from about the centre of Tasmania, from Queenstown. A couple of people did manage to see the eclipse. So this is the third eclipse, the Vava eclipse, 1911. This one, because the weather forecast was much more favourable, there were quite a number of expeditions. There was an official Australian expedition, there were 2 official British expeditions, and they came on the ship HMS Encounter. The Encounter was a British warship stationed in Australia. It was later handed over to the newly formed Royal Australian Navy. And during the First World War, it actually was the first ship first Australian ship to actually fire its guns in anger, and it also captured a German ship. James Worthington also mounted an expedition. He was with the McLean's expedition in Tasmania. He went independently and he organised his own expedition. And there was also a Czechoslovak astronomer called Stefanik, who was there on his own. He's a very interesting person. During the First World War, he was appointed as a French general, and also he was the Minister for War in a provisional Czechoslovak government. Sadly, he died soon after the end of the First World War in a plane crash. When I was in Prague some years ago, went to an observatory called Stefanik, which I didn't really realize until I was researching these eclipses, who Stefanik was. So if you've been to Stefanik Observatory, it's named after this astronomer. As I said, there are 2 British expeditions. There was the official one organised by the Joint Firmament Eclipse Committee, and this one was led by Father Aloysius Lawrence Corti from Stonyhurst College Observatory. He was helped in his observations by the officers and the men from HMS Encounter, and so here you can see an officer and two sailors from the ship, and there is Father Corti sitting down comfortably while he was setting up his instrument. And the second British expedition was organised by South Kensington Solar Physics Observatory, which was founded by Norman Lockyer. And I noticed that there are people from Norman Lockyer Observatory in the audience. Norman Lockyer is well known for his role in the discovery of helium, though it seems not all of that is quite. He probably gets a little bit more credit than he's entitled to, because Norman Robert Pogson was the first one in at the Indian eclipse of 1868 to notice helium in the sun. So the expedition was led by Norman Lockyer's son, William Lockyer, who also worked at the South Kensington Solar Physics Observatory. There was Francis McLean, who was now not organised his expedition, but came with his friend Lockyer, or friend William Lockyer. There's Joseph Brooks again, the retired surveyor, Henry Winkleman, the photographer, William Raymond, who was first assistant at Sydney Observatory, was now officer in charge of Sydney Observatory, and Roger Charles Anderson, who was recruited on the way. Anderson later became a well-known marine historian. All right. They rehearsed very carefully before the eclipse. Again, Lockyer's expedition had support from the personnel from the ship, from the officers and the sailors from the ship. And this is a scene while they were rehearsing, and it's a photograph that was taken by Winkleman, who climbed a coconut tree to be able to take this photograph. Among their equipment, they set up a shadow band screen. Shadow bands, of course, occur just before and just after an eclipse, because the light from the sun only comes through a very small spot on the sun, and then there are bands caused by the atmosphere visible. They try to see it on the screen. There's Joseph Brooks, the retired surveyor with a transit telescope, and his role was to establish the coordinates of the observing site, and also to obtain time. This is Roger Anderson here, again with sailors sailors using an equatorial telescope. Again, this is all during rehearsals. The instruments were generally same or very similar to those used by McLean previously, because many of his instruments were on loan from the South Kensington Solar Physics Observatory. There were a few additions, including a equatorial telescope with objective prisms. And I think it was Norman Lockyer who developed the idea of using objective prisms to obtain spectra. Totality, clouds were patchy. There were heavy clouds in both British expeditions, though Lockyer's group did manage to take one exposure with the coronagraph, which did see at least part of the inner part of the corona. But the Australians only had seen cirrus, so they were much more successful. They were 2 kilometers away from the British. So, as I said, the clouds are very patchy. Some places heavy, some places it was not. And the Australians were fortunate for seeing cirrus. And the most successful was Worthington, who was fairly close to the Australians. And they left on the encounter. They left for Suva, and from Suva, they made their own way home. And just to sum up, some useful information and observations were observed from the expeditions, mainly from the 1908 expedition. And as a reminder, there is James Short's photographs from the 1908 eclipse. And the various observing groups gathered experience in observing the sun and also in the logistics of organising eclipse expeditions. And international contacts were made and links formed. So they were still, even though some of the eclipses were clouded out, but still they all had their uses. And there was good publicity for astronomy in Australian newspapers. And just to finish up, there is further information. This is obviously a small part of what's in the book, Eclipse Chasers. It's a book about eclipses observed in Australia, starting with observations and knowledge of the First Nations people, eclipses observed by Europeans, starting from 1857, going up to the last eclipse, 1912, and the book also talks about the 5 upcoming eclipses in Australia. Some of you may come to some of those. There's one coming up on the 20th of April, and there will be a number of others, including the one in over Sydney in 22nd of July 2028. The book is already been released in Australia, but in UK, I understand, only be released on the 30th of March.
Thank you, Nick. That was
Thank you very much.
that was excellent as normal. Your book, which you've mentioned, full details were published in our last issue of e-news that David Sellers very kindly put together. So full details were there as well. There was a question there from Mike Leggett, if he wants to unmute himself and ask a question, Mike.
No, I haven't got a question. I was just registering my applause using the reactions button.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay,
Sorry, just a brief thanks to David Sellers as well for including the information on the book in e-news.
And David has signalled with a thumbs up, Nick. So there we are. I'm conscious of the time, ladies and gentlemen. So if there are any additional questions, you can communicate them either via myself, the meeting secretary, and I will make sure that our speakers or Nick will receive them in due course. I want to move on, please, to our last and final presentation tonight from Dr. Peredur Williams, who is an eminent researcher at the Institute of Astronomy at the University of Edinburgh, Royal Observatory, Edinburgh. And he's going to talk about the adventurous early life of Ralph Copeland, one of the many Astronomer Royal of Scotland. Peredur, over to you, please.
All right, thank you, Gerard. Share screen.
Thank you.
And screen. Share. Slideshow.
That's great. Yep.
That's working, is it?
It's a bit enlarged at the top. From my screen, it's cutting it off.
Yes, you're quite right, yes. And I think what I'm going to have to do is actually just enlarge this because I'm aware of time's waiting rather than fiddle around. So if people are happy with that, we'll do that. If you come into the Royal Observatory through the main entrance, you may or may not go past this mural picture of a chap called Ralph Copeland. And even if you do, you think, oh, well, this is just a Victorian worthy. And indeed, he is a Victorian worthy, but wow, he had a very interesting early life. And what I'm just going to talk about, and part of this also, is I just run up really these points in darker type. He lost his father at the age of 3. His education, we're told in the obits, he was educated in a local grammar school at Kirkham, but actually he was not. He was actually moved up to Skipton and was taught by a friend of his uncle, his mother's brother, who actually rather looked after him. And when he was about 15, it was decided he'd be apprenticed to his older brother to work in a cotton mill, but below me, he was too adventurous for that. It came about that this was a time of tremendous excitement, the Australian gold rush, and he wished to join that instead. And so actually, still at the age of 15, he embarked on the Star of the East off Liverpool, and there's a picture of it. And it took actually 75 days to get to Melbourne, and some fine description by someone else of conditions on that ship, which I won't go into. And there are also, if you've ever got time, wonderful descriptions of the gold rush and all the preparations for it by Charles Dickens in something called Household Words, which he edited. And that's really fun. Anyway, Ralph Copeland arrived in Victoria and on the Star of the East, and he went up not to Bendigo, where most people went. He went to Omeo in the direction of New South Wales, because there'd been reports of the tremendous mining there in the papers. And much of my information of this comes from an unpublished autobiography. There's a copy in the National Library of Scotland and another at the Royal Observatory of his daughter, his favourite daughter, Fanny. Anyway, it turned out his working in the diggings were terminated, at least for a while, by a shot wound in the leg. And the story is that his friends were sitting around waiting for gangrene or something to set in, and he'd more or less given up hope. And a large Zulu came in, who'd also been working on the gold fields, and chased everyone else out, cleaned up the wound, got lots of fresh air, and Copeland made a good recovery. And then the two of them went to work on a sheep farm, where Copeland, after all, there were dark skies in Australia, and he developed his interest in astronomy. And his mother had sent out a small telescope and some books. It must have been a great relief for her, I imagine, that he left the goldfields. In practice, he went back to the goldfields and was made a member of the vigilance committee amongst the miners because the police were not there. And these chaps were armed, and I mean, you know, he's not yet 21. We've got him departing in 1858 after 5 years. There's obviously, he's got his, one would say, got the adventure out of his system, but by no means. Interestingly, you'll see the date is given as 26. Now, that could very easily just be a mistranscription. Alternatively, he may actually have been lying about his age all the time in Australia, pretending to be 5 years older than he was, so pretending to be 21 when he landed. And he observed them at his Comiton route, of course, a long way round there, because he goes round the coast of South America. He then married his cousin, the daughter of his uncle, Richard Milner, who'd been the chap who looked after his education. And something which is not recorded otherwise is that actually his second child he named after John Herschel, was of course the grand old man of British science then. There's no record they were in touch. He himself was working as a volunteer apprentice at the Bay of Peacock Locomotive Works just outside Manchester. And of course, this was a really exciting time to be in the railways, just the real beginning, everyone's building locomotives. But he's actually still doing astronomy, and his first published observation was a lunar occultation of Kappa Cancri. This was controversial at the time because he said it was sort of stepped. It was not a clean occultation. This might be a binary star. And this actually has been confirmed later. So this probably was just a very good observation. He gave that up and went to Göttingen to learn astronomy. Now, his original idea had been to go to Cambridge, but there are two problems with that. The real one, I think, is that the Cambridge syllabus, although there was an observatory there, was very mathematical, and he was obviously not equipped for this and would need to be trained into mathematics and taught by a coach of some sort. And the other was actually religion, that his family were nonconformists. They were all chapel people, not church. And at that stage, Cambridge, unless you were an Anglican, you couldn't be admitted to any higher thing. You could actually get a degree by then. Also, Germany was the place to go. It's a tremendous place for doing science then, mostly because the people who taught it had themselves done research degrees. Here's Göttingen Observatory, and there actually, you can see there are slits there for transit instruments. It's the way a lot of observatories were made. Cambridge Observatory, and indeed the Royal Observatory at the Cape, which actually was modelled on it. You had central dome with a telescope, and then slits for transit instruments, and these are the transit instruments here. And even after only a couple of years, he and a good friend, Carl Vaughan, actually observed with one of the transit circles, which had been installed by Gauss. There's some lovely stories about Gauss, but no time for them. They observed a whole catalogue as part of the astronomical, as part for the astronomical Gesellschaft for the Bonner Durchmusterung. It turned out that they jumped the gun a bit, and they were using, although they've got advice from good people, they were using standards from the Nautical Almanac, and these were not quite approved of. So this was never actually accepted as part of the AG, but their catalogue actually remained the main catalogue for 30 years. He then went on and he submitted a PhD thesis. And I should say, because I had some correspondence with Ian on this, that the PhD there, you will see it's an inaugural dissertation for a philosophical doctor. This was actually in scope and content close to what we call a final year undergraduate project. It's only about 25 pages, and it's not a huge thing. What it is about, of course, as you know, is the orbit of Alpha Centauri. And what he did is he took the, well, it's basically most of it originally just a literature survey, and then doing a solution from the best possible positions to get the orbit. The family had actually, his family had gone to Göttingen. The son was born in 1866, and then tragically his wife died later that year. He's said to have actually moved into the observatory building because he's doing a lot of observing. And what we don't know, there's a huge amount we don't know about his life, because we don't know who looked after his children. Both grandmothers were dead, so they didn't go back to Britain. They must have been staying there. But he got then further excited. There was at the same time, while he was there at Göttingen, a chap called Captain Koldewey, who had led the first German Arctic expedition. And he was there over the winter. And he got chatting originally with Borgen and saying, you know, it'd be really nice. Would you like to join my next expedition and do a geodetic survey? And Borgen said, well, yes, but then could I have my friend Copeland along? And Copeland, who's obviously not, and we know from his early life and indeed his subsequent life, he's very fond of travel, said, yes, sure, I'll come along. And what they did actually just in the months before traveling, while doing the thesis and everything else, they actually wrote a short history of overwintering in the Arctic. And the purpose of this was to show that, contrary to popular belief, it was entirely possible for people to live in the Arctic. And they gave examples of even sort of British whalers who'd got stuck in islands and survived. And they also gave a sort of a scientific idea of what the work was going to be on this second expedition. So the expedition was set off, what we've got here, actually a useful picture. This is the first picture we have of Copeland. I have not been able to track down anything earlier. There's been a well-to-do family. His father-in-law, Milner, who's a reverend, there should have been wedding photographs or something, but just because of the death of his first wife, all sorts of stuff, I think, was dispersed. Anyway, there's Copeland, there is Borgen, and there's Captain Koldewey. And there were two ships, the Germania, which was purpose-built, reinforced for overwintering in ice. And that took only a few months to build, which is quite brilliant. And then the support ship, the Hansa, which is a sailing ship, and it was going to just carry a lot of stores, including coal. And the idea is it would return before winter and the Germania would stay there. And they left in 1869, sent off by the King of Prussia, as he was then, and going for the Sabine Island. Just to give you an idea, this is where you are. So here's the coast of Greenland, there is Svalbard, there's Sabine Island, and then this is a blown up area. And then if you look right down there, there is a sort of a harbor, Germania Harbor, and that's where they went. So Copeland actually had a rather varied time there. When I originally suggested this talk to Gerard, I gave a light-hearted title, being what I took to be the idea, and I'd say Copeland and Three Bears. Anyway, we're hearing now of the first of the bears, but there's no porridge. That he and Wagner went off and they shot 3 musk oxen, they cut their throats and skinned them, mostly Copeland, who was more experienced, which suggests he must have got some fine experience somewhere. This wouldn't have been either in the locomotive works or indeed, presumably, the observatory guardian. They were approached by a large bear. Copeland shot him and opened his jugular vein. And they had so much meat there, they had to roll the bits down the slope. And they were too heavy to move, so they had to come back the next day. On the route, they were on the Germania. The other ship got lost, but there was fog and there was a misunderstanding of signal. And the Hansa did not accompany them. Indeed, it actually got lost and stuck in the ice, and it miraculously survived, and that's another story on its own. And so one of the problems is that the Hansa was carrying extra coal for the Germania's boiler, and so they didn't have that, so they had to curtail a lot of their sailing. Anyway, come the winter, and the harbour that they'd come in on was now freezing up, so they sort of demasted the ship a bit. They still got the masts on. They covered it up heavily, and this picture's not as accurate as it could be. And then they built 2 stone observatories on higher ground, one magnetic, one astronomical, and then a whole row of posts so that the men, particularly Borgen and Copeland, could just get between them on a calm day. And says the latitude is 74 degrees. They went off on another sledge expedition, some of them, just 5 of them, Caldervey and Copeland. Also, they must have got on very well together. And it was quite hard work taking the sledge on a frozen sea, small tent, lamp for cooking, spirit, 2 guns and food, and a small supply of cognac. On October the 28th, they sort of set off at 3 in the morning, and Copeland was attacked by a bear. He was surprised by it at about 50 paces. It had broken from a barrier hammock and galloped up to within 5 paces, raised up and struck him down with both forepaws. Copeland had no time to load his gun and just instinctively slashed it and hit the bear on the nose with the butt end. And the bear's snout, which is sort of fairly delicate thing, got broken, and the bear ran away. After that, they did keep their guns loaded. And that's the second of the 2 bears. The conditions were actually very difficult on it. It's a very beautiful place, this accordion. I mean, these pictures were not done by them, but were done afterwards for the records of the story. There's an illustration also of traveling through the snow. One of the problems which you wouldn't have thought of traveling the snow was in fact that of the ice. They're rather that you don't have enough water, and so you've got to melt ice all the time, and actually the limit is the amount of spirit. And food ran low, and they ran off reindeer meat, and this actually really gave them dysentery, and they had an awful time of it. But they covered a lot of ground. Back near the base, Borgen had been measuring an occultation, which they were doing to get the time, and he got attacked by a bear. And fortunately, they kept shooting, and for the bear did drop him, because the real worry was that the bear did carry him quite a way. That if the bear could move fast and get away, then the bear could kill him and eat him without difficulty. In fact, Borgen was saved. He was treated by the doctor on the board, and he reported he didn't experience any pain and his wounds heated. There's a lovely story outside the period we're talking about that Borgen remained a friend of the Copeland family, and years later he visited them and he had Copeland's daughter Fanny sitting on his knee and showing her how the one thing that didn't work anymore was one of his eyes. But they were there, of course, for doing a geodetic survey, and here's a map of the survey, actually very quick. This is an enlarged version. This version, that's 88 kilometers to get to. So you actually have to set down very small baseline and then triangulate. This was tremendous occupation for astronomers at this time because of Cassini the Paris Observatory had done a geodetic survey and shown that it seemed that the Earth was not flattened at the poles as expected by Newton. And so there were geodetic surveys run by several countries, and this was really not going to be a definitive one, but because there weren't enough people and enough time, but to set up base stations and effectively do a reconnaissance. And they went up. I mean, now Copeland had to do most of the work, but Morgan was sort of sufficiently recovered. And they actually measured well, they got the latitudes from the edges of the sun. So they went up to about 75, not up here, it's up there, about 75 degrees 11. And so they covered about 39 minutes of latitude. And they got to the position of Sabine Island. This nearly came to an end. So about the last time they Copeland again going with Lieutenant Payer, one of the staff, doing some more exploring and climbing, good deal of climbing there. And they discovered Peterson's Peak, which is about the highest peak. But the boiler on the ship was giving trouble, and they knew they had to go back. And so they went back. Well, they used the boiler to get out of the ice and then the sails to get them back to Germany, where in fact they found that the Franco-Prussian War had broken out. So that's sort of the end of that bit. The next stage in Copeland's life, I'll give rather quickly, is he then went to Burr, Parsonstown. This is Lord Ross's place. And there's the two big telescopes there. There's the Herschelian, 36-inch Herschelian mount. So, and there is the Leviathan. And he had two duties, really. Well, his first duty was assisting the Earl of Ross using this telescope, measuring thermal radiation from the moon, switching off and on the moon, so that just like one does with infrared astronomy, the detector sees the moon, then a bit of sky, then the moon, then a bit of sky. One does that. The next thing he did was using the Leviathan itself. This was a very awkward telescope to use. As you probably know, you needed several people to work it. It's in principle a transit instrument, so you get the right height, but you can move, you can track for about 15 minutes that way. But it needed about 4 people to drive it. So you need someone the observer sitting somewhere up here, but then it's a Newtonian. And you had people to raise and lower it and get the thing up and down. And the first thing he did with that was sketches of Jupiter from the time of opposition. And he then colored them the next morning in watercolor. And these were then published by the Earl of Ross. The idea was, of course, to be really nice to see how permanent features were, but you could only track for about 15 minutes just because of the design of the telescope, so you could never get much rotation in the night, and you could never be clear the next night. And a minor thing is that actually by the time they'd actually made the stone of all the lithographs, it turned out that the period which they'd been using was not the right one, so they managed to get a better period anyway. But these are very attractive pictures published in the monthly notices. But the thing for which he is most known is probably his discovery of galaxies. Now, one didn't use the Leviathan to look for galaxies just because it was so cumbersome, but he was looking to see how many galaxies had spiral form. But you did find some new ones, and they were then called nova. And here is this is the Earl of Ross, but these are the notes made by Copeland, and I've just expanded some of them there. So he found a nebula proceeding a bit brighter in the middle, and this is now actually much more difficult observing than observing a planet. But when you're observing something like Jupiter, it's nice and bright, and so you don't lose your dark adaptation if you're busy doing sketching. But if you're looking at galaxies, you've got to make notes and measurements, but you can't lose your dark adaptation at all. Otherwise, you've got to wait a little while before you can see anything. So it's really very impressive observing. Anyway, he measured to a red star position angles over a whole lot of galaxies, and in particular, there were really 7 new ones and then 2 more. The coordinates in the chart were actually produced by Dreyer, who succeeded Copeland. And actually, there's a wrinkle there that there are 2 red stars Copeland used on the because this is the February the 9th when he found the septet. And then about April, he found 2 more stars. But actually, they're different red stars. And so the coordinates in the NGC, or original NGC, of Copeland's septet were wrong, as was pointed out by Cobalt. But you've still got, this is what Copeland is remembered for, to many observers, is the septet. And so you can now say, after this rather exciting early life, he's on the astronomer's radar. And I think this is a good place to stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peredur. That was fantastic. Thanks for looking forward to the article in the AA, which will be dropping on our doormats in the summer. So that would be great. If you would like to unshare.
Yes, indeed. Stop sharing now.
And
okay.
If there's, I've got to, before we all put our pajamas on, or depending on where we are in the world, any questions, please?
No, I'd just like to say thanks for a good presentation. Enjoyed that. Looking forward to the article myself.
Right, thank you then.
Okay.
I'll be doing the layouts in a few weeks' time, so you'll hear more from me.
Okay.
Okay. Before I close tonight's excellent webinar and thank our speakers, can I just confirm to you all that the as you probably know, that there are been recently announced national railway strikes here in the UK. So we had to quickly reorganize our spring conference from being in person and face-to-face to a special half-day online conference, which will be presented and delivered via Zoom. So that's going to be on Saturday, April the 1st from 1 p.m. And in reflection to the special day today, all 3 of our speakers are going to be lady members of the society. So that's great news indeed. So looking forward to that. The details of the link obviously will be sent out in the days before April the 1st. So please keep an eye on your emails if you don't mind. So in conclusion for tonight, I'd like to thank all our speakers, and I would like to all ask you to either physically or using the special indicator on Zoom to show your appreciation to all 4 of our speakers, please. Thank you all. I do appreciate our speakers. They have put together, obviously, a reflection of their own interests in the work, and we hope to hear from them again. These special webinars are an opportunity for our members in the society to do small, short presentations. So if you do have any ideas or suggestions that you'd like to present to the membership, please get in touch with me as soon as you can, and we'll put together another webinar. But of course, these webinars won't be I think they're once every year, so we'll do the next one about the same time next year. So again, thanks to John for putting together the webinar and the online and connecting everything for us. And I wish you all, wherever you are, either good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, and pleasant dreams. I hope you have a nice breakfast, or wherever you are, an evening meal. So from this international Society of History of Astronomy webinar. Good night to you all and safe journeys if you have to go home. Thank you and good night.